everybody. So excited to see everybody here for our 14th annual Tony Woyak Summer History Festival. Thank you all for coming. My name is Mary Gruhl. I am the president of the Washburn Heritage Association. And first of all, I want to just extend a thank you to Harbor Table for always providing this room for us 8 times a year. So, yay! And they always set up all the chairs for us, which is also very lovely. So, thank you very much. Well, what I wanted to do today, just for a couple moments, we did something very special this year with Homecoming in July, at the end of this month, and especially for you folks. We created a flyer, and you can pick one of these up after the show. I will have them in the back. On here, we have a list of the 60 presentations that have been uploaded to YouTube. Thank you to our videographer. Yay. Thank you, Chris. And we thought this would be really great with people who are coming for homecoming so they could see the heritage that they have been responsible for. Or if you see a program and you want to see it a second time, or if you missed one, or if you have somebody who wants to do it, or if you're a presenter and you just want to keep watching it because it was so good, right? Any of those. So these are going to be handed out at homecoming also, but we thought for sure you folks may very well enjoy it. There are 60 that have been uploaded, but there have been 83 total. At the beginning, we did not have a videographer. So how fortunate we are. Thank you, Andrew, for always being here, leaving your kids at home with your wife. I love it. On the other side, what we also have done for the purpose of homecoming and for you folks, you're probably all aware of the kiosk at the corner of Bayfield Street and 3rd Avenue West, those beautiful panels that they rotate all the time. For homecoming on Friday the 25th, all of them will be out on the 3rd floor of the Washburn Cultural Center between 1 and 4. So if you want to just immerse yourself in history, that would be wonderful. And I'm sure by now many of you know that they have, produced this wonderful book with all of the, not all, 28 of the panels are now in here. This is available in the back as well as in many of the stores. They have actually produced 36 in all, so maybe there's a second book coming along. They said no, but maybe there is. And just a couple of things, you know, we do have the orange cones here. I think you all know the reason why is after the presentation, our presenter will go in the back. You can ask the questions there. I will be in the back with these sheets if you would like one. And also it just protects our equipment that we got as a matching grant with a community education foundation. I'm missing a word. Thank you. And also, just as a reminder, this whole event is Washburn Heritage Association and the Washburn Area Museum. We work together, and at this point, I want to just say thank you to stand up and be applauded. Ginny Peterson, who is the chair of this event of the Tony Woyak History Festival Committee, somehow she and her group have figured out how to always get new presentations for every year. Let's give her So that's really quite, important to be able to reach out. So if you have ideas on what you'd like to see, certainly talk to Ginny and help her out. With that, I will pass it over to Ginny to introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And yeah, it's kind of, yes.
Jenny, before you do that, I just want to let everybody else know too here, starting tomorrow.
Wait. I'm going to give you the mic.
Yeah. Okay, starting tomorrow night, 5 o'clock, it's at the Cultural Center. We are having an art show. It's on honoring it's our lake shore, and we got local artists that have come and painted and photographed, and also they have written poems and so all this stuff. So this will be the entire month of July, and and this is being put on by the Washburn Forward Together group, and so we're going to have a number of receptions. Tomorrow will be the first, but we'll have others, and there'll also be some teaching classes and other things going on. So if you could come to the opening tomorrow, I think you'd really enjoy it. At 5 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you, David. I want to introduce our speaker tonight. Bob Mackreth, many of you have heard speak before. He's a local historian, and he is a treasure. He's an especial treasure for this Tony Woyak Festival, partly because it was his concept to start these history festivals 14 years ago. And not only did he have the idea and pitch it to our groups so that we could get it started, he has supported us in so many ways, especially by doing many, many presentations for us. I went back and tried to count all of them today, and if I've got the number right, I have 18 presentations in the past 14 years. Some of those, as Mary said, you'll find on YouTube, but he had done already 8 presentations before we started filming. And luckily, though, he doesn't quit once a presentation is done. Last season, he did a repeat performance and told us more information about A.C. Provert that we didn't know before when he gave the first presentation on the gentleman. And now tonight, he is going to give us a little plus to the presentations that he did in the very first season of Tony Woyak 14 years ago, when one of his presentations was on Tom Blake. So does anyone remember going 14 years ago to hear the Tom Blake performance? There's one, okay. But here,
you can leave then.
But here he is again. He's done additional research, and he's going to update what he gave us before. And as always, Bob does a wonderful job. And please welcome him warmly. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Ginny. That was incredibly kind of you. And thank you all for coming out. Yes, I hope you'll find some of this interesting. I find Tom Lake to be an absolutely fascinating character, and I could probably talk for 2 or 3 hours, but when I get too long, my wife is going to give me a signal, so you guys should be safe, I think. And I want to start this out by all of us getting together and going back to almost 80 years to 1936, and off the shore of Hawaii at Waikiki, where on that sunny afternoon, a young man from the Midwest paddled his surfboard into the waves off Waikiki. Though raised far from the ocean, he seemed to have an innate connection with the sea. That's good, because the waves were at least 20 feet high, the sort to test the skill of the most expert surfer. Years later, this surfer described how he felt while riding waves such as these. There is a peculiar joy and inner satisfaction in putting the force of a wave to work under a board. This may be because the force is spiritual, a divine force that has been in production by nature or God for a long time. Why say nature or God? Just this. Over the years, my close association with waves of all kinds, coupled with my religious background, has convinced this old surf rider that nature is synonymous with God. That's pretty heavy thoughts for a guy in 20-foot waves. But yes, that day, that wave, that ineffable force of nature seemed to carry on forever. The surfer passed over one reef and deftly veered to avoid another. On and on he went, riding a board that he built on his own. Everything came together that day. Board, man, and wave. And when the man and the wave and the board came to rest on the beach at the end of the ride, Tom Blake of Washburn, Wisconsin, had made the longest run in the history of surfing. And that record, set in 1936, still stands today. Kind of hard to believe. I read this, like I said, 12 years ago. I said, come on, guys, there's got to have been someone. I just Googled the hell out of it. Everything, no. Record still holds. So, yeah. As someone said, at the end of his long life, Tom would set more records and recorded so many accomplishments that one writer would call him probably the most influential surfer of the last century. Another added, a dozen or more men could have accomplished everything that Blake did alone. Even a partial list of his accomplishments is amazing. So, to give you a very quick idea of the makeup of the man I'm talking about, he wasn't simply a superb athlete, he was a thinker as well. And I want to just take a moment to talk about the history of surfing. I think most of us are aware. It was invented in California in the 1960s by 5 young men, 3 brothers, 1 friend from school, and a cousin from hell. And, within a matter of years, surfing was a rage. Everyone was out in the water, and famous surfers became national heroes. Annette Funicello, Elvis Presley. And that fascination has gone on through generations to modern veterans of surfing heroes. And of course, one of America's finest poets wrote an ode to the sport, and I think most of us know it well. If everybody had an ocean across the USA, then everybody'd be surfing like California. You'd see them wearing their baggies, Huarache sandals too, a bushy blonde hairdo, surfing USA. God rest you, Brian Wilson. Okay, I made 98% of that garbage up, okay? Here's what surfing really is all about. Surfing and Hawaii go together. Surfing is a cultural touchstone for Native Hawaiians. The very first white faces that encountered the sight of people surfing was Captain Cook and his crew, who arrived at what they then called the Sandwich Islands in 1798. And for years and years, this was the province of Native Hawaiians. And it wasn't just a sport. It wasn't fun and games. It was more than a fun activity in the waves. It was a cultural tradition that goes back centuries and carries deep meaning. Surfing served as a form of storytelling and communion with nature, reflecting a Hawaiian idea of mana, or spiritual energy. Did I get that anywhere close? Thank you, lady. Before Western contact, Native Hawaiian society followed a strict set of rules known as kapu. This reinforced a clear social hierarchy. At the top were the chiefs, or the ali'i, believed to possess sacred power. The ali'i used surfing to show their strength and leadership. Their surfboards were the longest, and commoners who dared to break these rules were faced with severe punishment. Surfing was a serious matter, not just a fun time. Not that they didn't enjoy it, I'm sure. But where does a kid from Washburn come into all of this? Let's talk about this fellow, Tom Blake. He was born March 8th, 1902. And there's a little uncertainty about the exact place he was born, but he was baptized in Milwaukee, we know. And sad to say, his mother died of tuberculosis when he was only 11 months old. And his father, was kind of a wandering sort, and he couldn't handle raising a kid on his own. So he left Tom with his grandmother and some aunts, and basically for the rest of his childhood, he bounced around from one relative to another. Ashland, Hibbing, but finally, he spent most of his youth right here in Washburn. He attended Washburn High School, but as far as I can tell, he missed graduating by this much. Tom was in the class of 1918, the year the school closed down because of the influenza epidemic. So, as far as I can tell, and when the school has checked the records for me, there's no record from that year. They probably got burned up in the fire in 1947. But I think it's safe to assume that Tom never got a high school diploma. But one thing he did get from the educational system here was, he was actually elementary school at St. Louis School. And somewhere around the age of 9 or 10, they were showing a newsreel that showed riders surfing, or other surf riders at Waikiki. It was just a short clip, but it made a strong impression. So yeah, Tom was raised, he was a football standout, but when the influenza epidemic hit and he left high school, suddenly he was out on his own. And for the next several years, he drifted, riding the rails. He said that post office cars were the most comfortable, but you ran the risk of getting caught. And his travels took him to New York, to Florida. He worked as a bartender in a speakeasy where they had a little bell to ring if the cops came in, where you had to pour all the booze down the toilet. Went all over, but California was really cold to him. But before that, he was visiting an aunt and uncle in Detroit. And in 1920, there he was 19 years old. He's with his aunt and his uncle, and they went to the movies. And one of the features was a newsreel about the American swim team and how they won gold medals at the recent Olympics. And one of those team members was there in the audience, a gentleman named Duke Kahanamoku. Now, Duke is going to come up several times in our conversation. And it's hard to explain just how much he means to the people of Hawaii. Yes, he's a star athlete, but he's so much more. He was a representative of Hawaiian culture at a time when it was overlooked. I was trying to think how how to bring it out. I was going to say, he's like the Babe Ruth of surfing. I decided in a very different way to say, if you went to Virginia and asked, what do you think of Robert E. Lee? That's the kind of veneration he inspires. Of course, Duke was one of the good guys, Robert E. Lee guy. But anyway, that kind of adulation, statues of him, he's absolutely a seminal figure in Hawaiian culture. And there is Duke in the theater watching himself on the screen, and there's 19-year-old Tom feeling confident, I guess, because after that movie was over, he went over, walked up to Duke, and asked if he could shake his hand. And Duke, who was a hell of a nice guy, said, of course, youngster. And Tom would later recall that moment. I felt that somehow he had included an invitation to me to come over to his own Hawaiian Islands. As I look back now, I realize how much I was influenced by this first contact with the man who has become the best-known personality in the history of surfing. Talk about a fateful random encounter. Well, he continued drifting for a while, but there's a place that called for him. And off he made his way to California. And there in California, he did odd jobs. Mostly he worked as a lifeguard, and he got a fairly regular gig at an outfit called the Los Angeles Athletic Club, which is mostly for well-heeled sportsmen, but they, as Tom was an employee, they let him use the facilities too as well. And, well, they noticed that Tom was one hell of a swimmer. And that year there was going to be a 10-mile race on the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, where all the biggest names in the East Coast world of swimming would be. And these Fat Cat members decided, let's subsidize Tom, pay his way back there, and see how well he does against all those East Coast champions. Ladies and gentlemen, he smoked them. Washburn, boy, notice the quality of the proofreading in the Washburn Times that day. Washburn boy wins 10-mile race in the East. Owing against some of the finest of the East Coast swimmers, Tom E. Blake of the Los Angeles Athletic Club won the 1-mile freestyle champion and continued to win the 10-mile race. That's pretty hot. And so, you can see that although a lot of people have come to the impression that the folks in Washburn totally forgot about Tom once he took a powder, that's not quite the case. They followed him from afar, and a couple of months later, there was some worrying news. Tom Blake disappeared. He's not been seen since August. And it goes on. None of his friends can find him. He lost a race, and then they just kind of went walkabout. All I can say is that's Tom for you. Tom was a unique character. He kept very much to himself. He was friendly and outgoing and was always willing to help others learn to surf, learn to swim, or listen to his ideas. But when it came to his private feelings, he wrote them down, but he didn't share them very much with others. Well, eventually he showed back up, and he continued working as a lifeguard and also picked up some bucks as a stunt double. You see him here with Clark Gable.
Wow.
And he made some big bucks on a movie set in Alaska. It was called this Tale of '98. Well, it was about the Klondike Gold Rush. And they brought a whole bunch of stuntmen up there. You see, I love this picture because they're the two others and they're all bundled up. They got the hats, they got the heavy coats, and there's Tom in the shirt sleeves. You know the guy is from, which one of the three is from northern Wisconsin. So, yeah, unfortunately, in the filming, the river was a lot higher than they expected it, and 3 of that group of stuntmen drowned. And Tom, was absolutely devastated, and I think that's part of the reason he spent so much of his time and effort later on in life to developing water rescue equipment. He also picked up some spare change modeling. I'm not sure where this photo would have been published, but it's not for me to judge. But one day while he was doing his lifeguard gig, he came across an old surfboard, and this is it, that belonged to one of the members. He'd never put his hands on a surfboard before. And he put it in the water, and if you think I'm going to say that instantly it was man and board and they melded together, he wiped out right away. So he put it back and brooded for a while, but then he took it out again a couple months later, and that time it clicked. He figured out what he was doing, and he said, this surfing stuff rocks. So saved his money, and then as winter came on, he said, I'm out of here, and he hopped on board a tramp steamer and made his way to Hawaii. And I'll digress again for a moment to talk about the islands where he arrived and the culture that Tom found himself in. Now, the Hawaiian Islands were united together as a united kingdom by King Kamehameha I in 1810. And for 80 years or so, they were an independent monarchy. They had their own kings. They had their own diplomatic corps, and they had embassies from other nations. And they also had a hell of an influx of American big shots looking to make money from sugar and pineapple. And by the 1850s or 60s, these guys were pulling a lot of weight, especially on Oahu. And also arriving very shortly after the unification of the kingdom were the missionaries. And interestingly enough, it's exactly the same outfit that sent the missionaries here to Madeline Island at about the same time. The American Federation for Foreign Missions or something like that. Outfit in New England. They were Congregationalists, and they had a specific way of looking at the world, and they wanted to make sure, well, let me put it this way, they wanted to turn Hawaii into New England with palms. And, you look at these folks, and you realize when they get a load of the folks surfing, it's not going to fly. And as the missionaries gained more and more influence, surfing began to wither away. So that was no longer all that widely practiced for quite a while, until the end of the 19th century, when a bunch of young native Hawaiians said this is nonsense and started essentially a surfing renaissance. And one of the most prominent figures was our man, Duke Kahanamoku. But in 1893, disaster happened. Those American capitalist bigwigs basically pulled off a coup and ousted the rightful queen of Hawaii, Queen Liuokalani. With help from the American ambassador and Marines from a Navy ship that just happened to be in the harbor, out come the rebels. The Queen says, I don't want bloodshed, and she resigned. And all of a sudden there was, quote unquote, a Republic of Hawaii run by Americans. Well, now this is an interesting thing. When the word got back to Washington, President Grover Cleveland was absolutely aghast. This is not sanctioned by Washington at all, and Cleveland was very, very disgusted with this, and he came out with some very strong statements that essentially this is not what the U.S. is about, pushing around smaller nations and taking over. And he wanted to get it going, to basically remove them, the coup plotters and all. An election came along, and William McKinley took office, and he said, that's fine with me. And so that was the end of American resistance to the coup. Now, of course, that happened before Tom arrived, but only about 25 years. It was fresh in people's minds, if they had any memory. And when Tom arrived, he didn't see that, at least at first. What he saw was essentially paradise. And again, years later, he reminisced about the old days. And he says, in the early days at Waikiki, I'm talking about my first trip there, 1924, the beach wasn't crowded. The surfers, probably less than 100 of them, all lived together in Honolulu and Waikiki. They got to love surfing so much, the young fellows, that they made a career out of it. They wouldn't take a job or go to work. They spent all their time on the beach at Waikiki. I got into the same rhythm with them when I went over because I was the first fellow from the mainland to do it, to actually go there and live there. You could live simply and quietly there. It was a very free and open, healthy life. You didn't think about smoking or drugs or anything like that, or alcohol. Surfing just took up all of your energy. And that essentially is the, quote, beach bum philosophy. And I use that term in a complimentary way, not derogatory. It's a guy who loves surfing. It's a priority over everything else. He may take odd jobs here or there, guiding tourists, giving swimming lessons, but the most important thing is the time he spends surfing. And if he needs to move, he moves. If the waves are running somewhere else or the temperature is dropping, he'll follow the surf. And as our poet said, he's on safari to stay. So, Tom has settled down pretty well into this environment, and one of the first things he wants to do is look up Duke Kahanamoku. Well, as it turned out, the Duke was on the mainland at the time and giving a tour of some sort. But Duke had 6 brothers who were also very skilled surfers. They said, come on over. And very shortly, they basically adopted him, treated him like a brother too. And he learned Hawaiian culture. He learned about the fine art of surfing from the best teachers he could possibly have found. He soon became known as one of the best surfers on the island, winning competitions even against native Hawaiians. And that kind of took some diplomacy, because Tom was humble and he didn't want to, act like he was a big shot or anything, but he also wanted to win. So it was a balancing act, but I think people came to realize that Tom was the real deal. And eventually he came to realize that unlike it was with competitive swimming and surfing, it really doesn't matter who wins or who loses. It's the ride. And eventually, after about 10 years, he gave up competition entirely and focused on inventing and getting out there in the waves and communing with his God. And as this time was passing, he actually became fast friends with Duke Kahanamoku. And they were friends for the rest of their lives. And they'd actually competed against each other years before at swimming competitions. Just like Tom, Duke wasn't just a surfer, he was a competitive swimmer. Most of the time Duke won, but there was one time Tom beat him. It's 1928, and Tom just said, he was past his prime. That's the only reason I beat him. Again, that's the kind of guy that he was. So for the next 30 years, except during the war, Tom would go out to Hawaii half a year, maybe sometimes more. He liked the tramp steamer life. He hated flying when he eventually tried it. He liked getting out there in a boat where things were chill. You didn't have to worry about cigarette smoke from the others. And sometimes he would go out in the winter and come back in the summer and work, make money over here on the mainland. And sometimes he'd just stick around. Sometimes he lived in a shack. Sometimes he slept on a boat. What mattered was the time he spent in the water. Well, unfortunately, the war came, and we'll get to that in a moment because I almost skipped something. Because what else was he doing? He was thinking and inventing. You see, the problem with surfing in those days was the surfboards themselves. They were heavy sons of guns. They were solid wood, and they'd weigh up to a couple 100 pounds for the big ones. And that kind of discouraged a lot of people from getting into the sport, as you had to lug this humongous slab of wood down to the beach. It had advantages, once you got this big heavy board on the beach, it would, ride fairly stably because it's so darn heavy. But I'm saying, nah, there's got to be a better way. And he puts his brains together, and he looks at the old ancient surfboards in the Bishop Museum. The Bernice Hauhui Bishop Museum is sort of like the Smithsonian Institution of Hawaii. It's the most important museum and collection of cultural artifacts and natural history items in the state. And he somehow managed to talk the curators into allowing him to take out some of the ancient boards and work on restoring them. He said, they're just hanging there, getting dusty. I could put them back in shape for you. And they told him to go away, and he came back the next year, and they said, well, all right, give it a shot. So there you see some of the, and you look at the size of some of them, you can see how they weigh a ton. But Tom's idea was, he thought about what he'd seen about airplane wings. He said, I could make a hollow board with bracing inside. And that's basically what he did. He came up with this design for a lightweight, hollow, internally braced surfboard, and then he started teaching others to build them. Well, they certainly were better than the big heavy ones, but it was a hell of a lot of tedious work to build one of these things with all the internal braces and such. And they had a problem with leaking. But man, the first time he got into a race with one of these boards, he ran circles around everyone else. And that was about the time he gave up competition because everybody looked at him and said, man, that was not fair. And he didn't want to do that. But let me tell you how he thought about it. Well, no, let me jump here a little bit. I gotta tell you the news. These hollow boards went out of style around 1950 or 60 or so, when folks on the mainland got a better idea of making boards out of fiberglass laminate. You'd get fiberglass on the outside, lightweight foam-type material on the inside, and put it together in the factory, and there it was. Light, and it didn't leak, and you didn't have to worry about maintaining it and varnishing it. So Tom's hollow surfboards were a fine idea, but they didn't last. They got others thinking about how to lighten the surfboards, though. But one invention that he had has lasted until now. He was the first guy to come up with the idea of putting a fin on a surfboard. If any of you are surfers out here, you might call it a skeg. That's the kind of slang term for it, but it's a fin, okay? And he had got the idea, I wonder, how that would work. But he didn't get around to do anything about it for 6 years with his tunnel, all right? He said, surfboard, the light surfboards going everywhere, but it took me a while. You didn't hurry things over there. You were having too much fun surfing every day, but I found an old boat and stripped the bottom and put the fin on a surfboard, and it worked fine. It was a shallow fin, about 4 inches deep and a foot long. And I took it out. I finally put the pin on the board, and went out into the surf and paddled out. And in paddling out, the board had an entirely different feeling with the skeg on it. It wasn't entirely a likable feeling, but I remember at first thinking, well, this is no good. But then I got a pretty good wave, and right away found the remarkable control you had over the board with the skeg on it. It didn't spin out. It steered easy because the tail held when you put the pressure on the front. You could turn it any way that you want to. I knew right away it was a success. And then he went on. I consider that my good, solid contribution to the sport. Gives me a lot of pleasure when I see the kids drive by with their cars and the fins on their boards. Yeah. Now it's gotten to me. Every time I see guys going around surfboards and the fins, a guy from Washburn did that. But I look like a crazy old man. Well, I always do anyway, but never mind. He didn't just confine his inventions to surfboards. A lot of people say that Tom designed the first underwater camera. That is an exaggeration. There had been attempts to construct underwater cameras going all the way back to the 1880s. Tom's, though, was one of the first practical ones that eventually could be manufactured. And he made himself a name by publishing an article in the National Geographic with photos of surfers from Waikiki, and everybody got a look, and it's this waterproof camera, so cool. And then, of course, he was the first guy who came with the idea of putting a sail on a surfboard. The first design was kind of, impromptu, but he got a better idea, and windsurfers today can thank Tom Blake for building the very first windsurfer. Like they say, a dozen guys could have done that. Tom did it all by himself. But what really he focused on after a while was water rescue equipment. He was a big believer in paddle boards as a rescue tool. The lifeguards could get on the board and paddle out incredibly fast by swimming standards. It didn't require anywhere near the effort of swimming out, and it was a hell of a lot safer. And he pushed the idea of paddle boards everywhere that he went. Another thing that he worked on, the first aluminum ring buoy. He patented that, an outfit in California manufactured and sold them. He made a aluminum torpedo buoy, and you'll see these at beaches all the time. The aluminum ring buoys kind of fizzled out. These things have lasted. And just this year, the American Society of Inventors honored Tom as a newest member of the Inventors Hall of Fame. So even after all this time, his reputation as an inventor is still there. And of course, that wasn't all, because hey, with Tom, there's more, but wait, there's more. He was an author. He did the very first book on surfing in between riding waves. And basically, he was an evangelist for surfing. On the time when he was back on the mainland, he spread the gospel of surfing everywhere he could. He organized the first surfing competitions in California, and of course he won everything, but he took his paddleboard with a couple of friends. They paddled all the way out to Santa Catalina Island, 26 miles. And he got that in the papers too. He wanted people to know about surfing and paddleboards and all of that good stuff. But the outside world intruded in 1941. The Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor right there in Hawaii. And Tom, at age 42, enlisted. A hell of a lot older than your average soldier. He joined the Coast Guard, which made sense. And for the duration of the war, he was signed on with the Coast Guard, and they put him to work. A number of things, one of which was teaching rescue swimming, which made a lot of sense, but they also used him, assigned him to ammunition loading duties on ships. He said, that scared the hell out of me. But after the war, Tom returned to his usual way of life in Hawaii, but things started to change. And now, it's kind of painful because for a world-class athlete, sometimes it's hard to accept the fact that you're not as good as you used to be. I mean, some people handle it well and some people don't. But in 1952, Tom got a glimpse of mortality. And he was surfing with a couple of friends at a place called Makaha, known for big waves, the kind of waves that only Tom or someone of his skill would want to be out in. And something very humbling happened. I got in trouble at Makaha, and I got in some big breaks. Instead of getting mixed up with my board, I pushed it away, and I took the brakes and got ground around the bottom, and it almost passed out. For the first time in my life, I realized I was getting old. Tommy Zahn was off to the side. I swam over to him, and I willingly and gladly got on his board, and he paddled us to shore. That was the beginning of the end. Well, it took several years for him to give up surfing entirely, but in 1955, Tom made one of the breaks of all, biggest breaks of all. He left Hawaii. And to give you an idea how well known he was, they wrote a newspaper article. Honolulu Star Bulletin, 1955, whatever date. Tom Blake, one of Waikiki Beach's most familiar figures, left the islands last night after saying his 30-year romance with the white crescent of sand is over. The beauty of the surf and the sand and sky will never die for him, but he said that the thrill of surfing that sparked the love affair is gone. I'm too old now, I guess. I'm not happy here. One reason behind his surprising decision lies, he says, with age. Part of it is the fading away of old surfing companions, and part of it is the change at Waikiki. It used to be so quiet. You used to know everyone there. And this is what Waikiki looked like at that very time. So he faded away from the island, but he didn't give up on his vigorous athleticism. He spent basically the next 30 years drifting around the continental U.S. wherever the mood took him. According to one of his friends who knew him at the time, Tom owned one plate, one cup, one spoon, one fork, and one knife. That was all a fellow needed. And he'd pick up jobs here and there as a lifeguard. That was his main bread and butter by then. And because he figured nobody would want to hire a 55-year-old lifeguard, he shaved 10 years off his age when he applied. And he was in such good shape, nobody ever questioned him. And in the course of his lifeguard employment, he conducted a couple of spectacular rescues, including one where a boat capsized offshore, and Tom paddled out and rescued part of the crew until another boat could come and get the rest. Again, newspaper headlines. Local lifeguard in daring rescue. But as I say, he wandered around sometimes California, sometimes Florida, sometimes Arizona. Always in a beat-up old van, a station wagon. Wherever he could camp, that's where he'd stay. And while he was there, he was thinking. He was the sort of fellow, he did a lot of reading, and all this time he was putting together a philosophy of life. For the next 20 years or so, I says he stayed on the road and devoted his attention to recording his thoughts about the great questions of life and existence. In 1982, Tom completed the first version of his magnum opus, a lengthy essay, book-length essay, mind you, called The Voice of the Atom. Now, it was never commercially published, but there's a copy of it in the Washburn library. And I tried to read it, and you notice I say tried. It was very heavy going. And here's just part of the introduction. Let's see, the authorities and information in this story was patiently gleaned from 78 years of life on Earth, as well as the study of the thoughts and experiences of such illustrious names of the Old Testament Bible as Noah, Abraham, and Isaiah, from the ancient wisdom of India, the Hindu Vedanta, from the New Testament people, Jesus, St. Paul, Peter, John, Matthew, Luke, from philosophers and sages of long ago, Descartes, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Socrates, Aristotle, Gautama, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Zeno, Mohammed, from scribes such as Swedenborg, Spinoza, Emerson, Thoreau, Bacon, Schweitzer. That's only halfway of it. But in the book, he does put out his overall uniting philosophy. And a lot of what he writes in the book is told in the form of a conversation with a mysterious hitchhiker he picks up named Anthony. And he tells Anthony in one of these conversations, years ago, I felt I had found the ultimate answer. Some kind of, and unless I wanted to leave some sort of record of my thoughts, I saw myself getting old and dying. The secret I felt should be shared. God as nature is not myth. Immortality of our being is a great truth. Jesus Christ's great promise, the indestructibility of our atoms, before the time of science and Jesus, our fate seemed to be dust to dust. Now we know the true significance of that dust. It is composed of atoms, which do have the gift of eternal life, that power and force of nature and God. Now, I don't know how the hitchhiker felt about that, but it's some pretty heavy thoughts. And one day in 1962, his ramblings brings him right back to Washburn. And he looks around and sees how much the place has changed. And he wrote a letter to the editor of the Washburn Times in which he said, this is my first visit in 40-some years. And beneath the pines of Memorial Park, I see that although things have changed, they have still remained the same. And he goes on at great length and finally ends with telling the young people of Washburn there's no better place in the world. There's nothing in the cities or anywhere else that is better than what you can find here. And then he takes off, as Tom was wont to do. But 6 years later, he came back. And from then on, he spent every summer at Memorial Park. Sometimes he camped somewhere else, but that was his number one hangout, was there he was at Memorial Park. And the local teenagers, you know, small town, everybody talks, they know this guy as Tony Woyak, our beloved Tony writes, let's see, where did it go? When I was growing up, with Mickey Amron, Ricky Leno, Tommy Mager, Ronnie Morrison, and my cousins Jeffrey Dibble and Jimmy Gingo, we'd go to Memorial Park and we'd see this older gray-haired fellow with a nice suntan, sandals, khaki shorts, who drove a white van and stayed there at Memorial Park. We called him Surfer Joe. And we just thought, pardon the expression, that he was a beach bum. And that he was. But he was so much more. If I knew then what I knew now, I would have asked more questions. Yeah, Surfer Joe. It's like you have, like I said, let's take Babe Ruth. You got baseball, Babe Ruth playing on your team. Nobody knows his name, so you just call him Baseball Bob. You know. Now, this is one of the immortals right here. So, he's still thinking of that philosophy, and he wants to get that message across. So he paddles out off Houghton's Point, and he carves into the rocks. T. Blake, nature equals God. And it's easy to see from the lake, not so easy to find from the land, but it's still out there. And Tom? Well, he stuck around. After a while, he gave up driving in his 80s, and he essentially settled down here for the last years of his long life. He eventually got an apartment in Ashland, but every day he'd walk 5 miles, go down to the beach, and look out over the water, and just think about whatever Tom would be thinking about. He died on May 5th, 1994, 3 days short of his 92nd birthday. And I am sure somewhere the atoms that made up Tom Blake are out there in a world of endless summer. So, I would stop there, but for an adventure I had last October, I decided I had to see all these places for myself. So I went out to Hawaii, and the first stop I made was that very same museum, the Bishop Museum, and I got out there and said, wait a minute, is this Washburn again? Well, it's the same style of architecture, the Romanesque revival, but it's not made out of Chequamegon Bay sandstone. There's no sandstone at all in those volcanic islands. It's made out of basalt. They call it bluestone. Doesn't look blue to me, does it? Yeah, okay. But yeah, I was feeling good out there in Hawaii. I'd finally gotten there, and just incidentally, that made my 50th state. Once I touched down at the Honolulu airport, I could truthfully say I've been to all the states of the Union. But like I say, that museum was my main target. I don't know that too many people go to Hawaii with the idea, I'm going to spend the whole time indoors. But you know, that's me. And there, on the 3rd floor, is one of Tom's surfboards. One of several he made from Duke Kahanamoku. And in one of the corridors, they have a display, portraits of the most prominent surfers. The lighting was crummy, but I did my best, and of course the very first at the head of the line was the Duke. And right next to him in the number 2 place was Washburn's Tom Blake. Wow. That's the place he holds. Well, that was pretty moving to me, but I had to get into the archives, so what I really wanted to do was, dig around and find out as much information that I could, answer some nagging questions, and I got a lot of help, and I've had a lot of answers. And one of the most helpful people I met there was actually the head archivist who's written books on surfing, and he came out wearing a Tom Blake t-shirt. He swore up and down He didn't have any idea I was coming. I just took it out of the drawer. It was on top. Yeah, there it is. Tom Blake t-shirt. Not as flamboyant as mine, but the logo is there. Great guy. He's written several books, and we talked for hours, it seemed. So I got the questions I wanted answered. And then it was share it with you. I was walking along the shoreline, and if you're going from Waikiki, I was in a hotel all the way at the far end. It was kind of away from the crowds. So you'd walk through a park and walk along the beach to get to the more commercial strip of Waikiki, which I did my best to stay away from. But the stairways coming up from the beach every so often. And as I'm walking down the beach, the light is fading, and a young woman comes up carrying a surfboard over her head. And I got to put this tactfully, this woman was like a perfect 10, and she was hardly wearing anything at all. And the very first reflexive thought that came to my mind was, you know, she couldn't be doing that if it was one of those old-fashioned heavy surfboards. And then I'm thinking, you know, Bob, tomorrow go out and touch grass. So on that cheery note, excuse me, well, I don't need that. I came home, I had one more errand to do. Last day that I was there, I went down to the beach in front of my hotel, and I filled up a jar with sand from the beach. Came back home a few weeks later. On Veterans Day, I walked across the street where I live, right to the cemetery, up to Tom's grave, and I sprinkled the Waikiki sand on his grave. That was, I thought, I needed to do. So on that cheery note, thank you for coming. Remember, on pain of death, do not cross this orange line, and I will be back in the back to answer any questions you have. Again, thank you all for coming. I want my formal outfit.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was wonderful. We all enjoyed it so much.